Welcome back to the Faith Seeking Understanding podcast, where we do deep dives into philosophy and theology for an anti-fragile faith. We're busy walking through our view on divine providence. So we're still, in the last two episodes, we articulated this view, which we're calling omni-instrumentality, because everything is a divine instrument of God on this view. What that means and how that works out in the case of freedom is more or less what we've been working through in the last two episodes. So we're not going to cover any of the ground there. We're going to assume that you've watched or listened to those episodes, because it would just be too much to go over.
Yeah, it is a lot to take in though. So
yeah,
what's the gist of it? If we were to condense it down to maybe 3 sentences.
Okay. The basic idea is that God controls things through his concurrence with secondary causes. What is concurrence? Concurrence is God's essential cooperation with nature. Essential cooperation is one of 3 different kinds of cooperation, and we've already articulated those, and we're going to explore some of those in more detail in the next episode when we compare our view with other views that are common, I guess. But in the case of essential cooperation, and this will be important for our episode today, we particularly in the second episode, we articulated this idea that there's what there's what the agent acts on, and there's the instrument the agent acts through.
Yeah, that distinction is really important.
Yeah. So in our case, in the case of artifacts, when we're using instruments like a paintbrush, or I often talk about a prodder, which is just you take a stick out of, from the garden and you move a stone around in some figure 8 or something on the ground. The stick is the underlying thing that I act on. So it's got its nature and a whole bunch of things of itself, but then it's also got a bunch of potentials that it can't realize on its own, right? So it has the potential to move in a figure 8, but its own nature is going to make it move in a straight line, right? That's just Newton's law of inertia kind of thing.
Yeah.
So what I do as an agent, as the first agent, the primary cause of the stick's motion, is I actualize that potential that's in the thing to bring about the instrument, namely the prodder. The prodder is able to move in a figure 8 or whatever motion I make it move in.
Yeah.
And the difference here is that in acting on the stick, I in some sense constrain the stick. When I actualize the potential, I make it to be actual in a particular way. But in doing so, I establish the prodder's existence and its abilities to do things.
Yeah.
Now in God's case, he doesn't act on pre-existing things. He creates from nothing and he acts on nothing. So we spoke about how what he acts on is our constitutive principles. So whatever you take that to be in your favorite theory of ontology or whatever, we would go with form and matter or essence and existence or something like that. But if you're a materialist, go mad. Materialist, I guess, apart from God, then go mad with that. Whatever you're made out of that can't act on its own, he acts on that. And then in doing so, he establishes our nature, which gives us all our natural powers, including our free ability for free choice, but also our abilities to reason about things, to have certain passions and pleasures, to move around, to see, to do all the sorts of things that we do. And he acts through that. So just as I establish the prodder's powers and its exercise of those powers by acting on the stick, so too God establishes both my powers and the exercise of those powers by acting on my constitutive principles. So that difference is quite important. So there's the underlying thing and there's the instrument, and that relationship. So that's a big distinction that comes out of thinking through essentially ordered series and essential cooperation in more detail.
Yeah.
I'm getting confused because essential cooperation is the sort of causation that occurs in essentially ordered series, but we haven't been speaking about essentially ordered series. So,
what's really important in the view and sort of the next step on that, which we went into more detail in the previous episode, was then the fact that when God is working through our constitutive principles, what's included in what makes us who we are, what's essential to our nature as humans, is free will, and the fact that we can, by our own agency, in some sense, make our own decisions. In a truly meaningful sense, make our own decisions. So when God is acting through us, that's how it doesn't actually contradict. We don't actually have two sides of attention that can't go together. We've actually got a system where, or a way of articulating it that shows how God is acting through us without compromising free will. So we are genuinely acting for ourselves. As part of that same process.
The way I sometimes think about it is, so we said, and again, in the first episode of the previous two, we spoke about what nature is. And in some sense, nature is this irreducible, it's irreducible to the parts that a thing has. If it is reducible to the parts, we call that an aggregate. And if something is added over and above, say from our conceptions or understanding of something, that's an artifact. But nature is this thing that exists over and above its parts, but is not, but exists in itself. Doesn't depend on us to think about it. And the way I sometimes illustrate this to people when talking just about irreducibility is consider you, the moment before you die and the moment after you're dead. Right? You have all the same material makeup, right? It looks like matte. Right? Like that's how we can identify the corpses of our loved ones, right? It looks like the person, but this corpse is not able to do all of the things that Matt was doing a second ago, both voluntary and involuntary in terms of pumping the blood around the body and all those sorts of things, right? So there's something in Matt as living that exists, and it's over and above the individual parts that make him up, right? And it's that which gives you the nature of a living thing, right? And in that, you have your freedom, you have your ability to reason about things, to choose between different alternatives, to do all these sorts of other things. And so if it helps, you can kind of think of God as God's action is in part making the difference between the corpse and the living thing. Obviously, it's more than that because God's action is also keeping the material constituents in existence as well. But, and so just as I make a stick into a prodder, God makes a corpse into a living thing, if you will, and so God doesn't act on our will, rather by acting on our constitutive principles, He brings our will into existence, and so His acting through us is what enables us to will in the first place, and that's the proper placement of God. That's how you properly appreciate God's position in reality as like the prime mover or the primary cause of everything. Right,
so that pretty much brings us up to speed, I think.
That wasn't 3 sentences, but it
wasn't quite 3 sentences, but it also wasn't
2 hours.
Sure.
If you want the full explanation, the last 2 episodes are where you, with diagrams, the last 2 episodes are where you want to go.
And going into detail about a whole lot of the distinctions that we make and all that. But in a nutshell, that's now our starting point. That's where we're working from in this episode. So where to from here? You kind of want to move towards ancillary issues, right? So ultimately, we want to answer questions like God's role in suffering. How does this work with things like predestination and grace and all those sorts of things? But before we get there, there's like immediate ancillary questions or follow-up questions, or they're almost like corollary. I guess not many people would know the difference between those two things. But in mathematics, corollary is like an immediately following result after a main result. So there's corollary issues that we need to address first, and they, in part, will help us understand the position itself. But also are addressing things that aren't directly the articulation of the view. So the two that I think are critical are: does God cause evil? Is God in some sense the author of evil in this view? And then the second is, how does this view contrast with other commonly held views? The 3 that I have in mind are Molinism, Benesianism, and compatibilism, which we'll define in the next episode when we go and contrast them. So I mean, the problem of evil, I think, is in an important sense a sort of spanner in the works. That, okay, well, if we're articulating it this way, a big objection or big problem that we might have is how then do we account for evil on our model? What does that say about God? How does that resonate with our experience? And I mean, you made a distinction a moment ago between the problem of suffering as a sort of ancillary issue and the problem of evil as a corollary. In a whole lot of ways, actually, those are quite entangled with each other,
Yeah.
and are certainly going to be felt together.
Yeah.
Often in the same moment, in the same conversation. So I guess as a point of departure, it's worth just sort of clarifying there what we are talking about, what we aren't talking about in this episode. And a whole lot of things that we aren't talking about in this episode, actually we will circle back around to later on, because I do think we need to address some of those questions. But when we talk about the problem of evil, would it be fair to say that we're talking about evil itself, whereas with the problem of suffering, we may be talking about our experience of evil?
Yeah, that's one aspect of it. I think one way you could say it also is to say, in this episode, we're talking about we're
evil as a metaphysical.
Evil as a metaphysical reality, and concerns that are particular to our model or the class of model that we're proposing.
Yeah. Whereas
the problem of suffering would be problems for any view that has a decently strong view of divine providence. So it would be a problem. So what we're going to discuss today is sort of unique to omni-instrumentality, or at least the broader Augustinian Thomistic class of models of divine providence. Whereas the later issues of the problem of suffering would be applicable to Molinists as well that aren't in this camp, or any view that thinks that God is in control to some degree.
Yeah.
So that would be another sort of distinguishing aspect of it. Yeah. So in this one, we're particularly concerned with. We've said that the way that God controls things is by causing them to happen. So now, have we just made, and so then add to that, evil things happen. So does it follow then that God is the cause of evil?
Yeah. God causes things to happen. Evil happens. God causes evil. You can see how that might follow.
Yeah, seems pretty straightforward. And that's something this particular problem is something we want to avoid. I think in Christian theology, we want to distance God from evil, and we want to say he uses evil, he permits evil for the sake of good, for the sake of his plans, but he does not cause it. And so we have to figure out what exactly that means.
Because I would say that then he's somehow responsible for evil.
Yeah.
Does that not somehow make him evil?
Yeah.
Yeah, those are all things that we want to avoid.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's
what we're talking about today.
Yeah.
So how do we get there? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I guess I wonder if the best place to start might be thinking about what is evil, or would that
we could start there.
Is it essential to the view?
It is actually essential to our view that we understand that evil is the privation of good.
Right.
That view is pretty popular in theistic circles. It was made particularly popular by Augustine. I suspect it was discussed before, but I know for sure that Augustine discusses it explicitly.
Yeah.
And some views of divine providence, when they deal with this question of their own model, they don't really rely on evil being the privation of good particularly strongly. It's just sort of another fact that they're like, cool, okay, evil's the privation of good, but this is how I explain why God is not the cause of evil.
Yeah.
In our view, it's a necessary. It's like if it turns out tomorrow that evil is not the privation of the good, then this model doesn't work, right? So it's pretty essential in that regard.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can say much more than that. I guess we could say, what is privation?
Yeah. So that was actually I remember when I first came across that way of understanding evil. Like there was something that was intuitive about it that I think I would have used some of those same sorts of terms. Like I wouldn't have said privation because I didn't know that word, but I would have said that, well, evil is just the absence of good. But then what was a bit of a mind bender for me was then, but you've got evil things. Paul talks about evil almost in a like as a force to be reckoned with almost. It very much sounds like the way that we talk about evil a lot of the time, that it's a thing, or the way that we talk about something that is evil. It sounds like that's a trait of that thing, or a real way of a real thing that is sort of describing it. Doesn't that sound like evil is not the absence of anything? It actually is a thing itself.
Yeah, so I should say we're going to say some cursory comments here to address that concern. But if you want to really deep dive into this, David Oderberg, and again I'll link this in the description of the video and the podcast. David Oderberg has a really great paper titled "The Metaphysics of Privation."
Okay.
I feel like I've gone back to it like every 2 years as I've been thinking about this more and more, and it's really good. It is quite technical, but I think if you kind of skim through the bits that are kind of boring to you, or whatever that is, the examples that he musters and the sort of analysis that he gives is very helpful. Now, I'm just remembering it off the top of my head, so I hope I don't misrepresent what he says. But the basic idea is that there's a difference.
Just before you get stuck into it,
okay.
I actually I haven't read that one.
Okay.
But I have read Brian Davies' The Reality of God and the Problem of Evil.
Okay.
Or maybe it's the other way around. I think it's the Reality of God and the Problem.
Sounds like the right way of going.
Yeah. But that was also really good. So it's going to be like that was my frame of reference, and also we'd need to go back to it. But is that a book? Yeah, it's a book.
Okay,
it's a book.
Yeah.
Perhaps a bit more accessible than Oderberg's paper. If it's
more accessible. It's more accessible in one sense and less accessible in another. It's more accessible in the sense that it's easier to understand. It's less accessible in the sense that you have to pay for it.
Fair. But anyway, I also just wanted to mention that resources, something to point people towards, but also it's going to be interesting to see if it brings out any differences in the way that we...
Okay, yeah, nice.
I think you've read
I haven't
Davis.
actually.
Oh,
I haven't read Davis,
okay.
yeah.
Okay, well,
I've seen it recommended in many of the Thomistic circles that
Yes.
I've been in, so I know it comes highly well regarded.
Yeah.
So
it is very
I
good.
haven't read it.
It is very good.
Yeah. I only just got a book by Norris Clark, one of the many that has also recommended in those circles, and I've been in those circles for like 12 years now or something. So, I mean, the main point, the first point to say is that when we say that evil is a privation, well, actually there's 2 points. Yes, we are ascribing to evil some kind of negative reality, as in it's not something that it's parasitic upon something that exists of itself, which is the good. That is important. And that is in part, I think, where Augustine is coming from, where he articulates this view. Like, it's not that there's this duality in existence between evil and good, and they're like opposing forces. Yeah. It's more like things are good insofar as they exist, and evil is sort of a lesser existence. It's like a reduction of that existence or that goodness in things. So the evil is particularly that negative difference that you ascribe to something. So that's the first thing. So there is, yes, to acknowledge the concern, there is generally a sense in which we're saying evil is a negative, non-positive reality. Okay. Yeah. However, a privation is not the same thing as an absence. And this is a privation in general now. So we're saying privation of good, but you can have a privation of heat, right? Or a privation of good language in a proper grammar or something like that, right? You can have all sorts of privations, and evil is just a particular branch of a particular species of that. A privation, the difference, so to give an illustrative example, again, coming back to the horse, it is not a privation of the horse's nature that it doesn't have wings, but it is an absence of the horse's nature, in the horse's nature, right?
Yeah, sure.
So the horse doesn't have wings, but there's no privation there at all. Yeah. It's not a natural evil for the horse.
If the horse didn't have a nose...
That's a different issue, right? Or if it was missing one of its legs, or if it was sick, like it had a blood infection or something like that, prevented its heart from properly working. These will all be privations, and not merely absences. The main difference, as far as I can tell it, that's like is that a privation is the absence of something that's otherwise expected. Yeah, it's that delta of what's expected to what is in reality. Yeah.
That's how I always understood the absence of something that we would the absence of something that we would otherwise expect to have been there.
Yeah, and the otherwise expect, it's going to depend on what you're talking about, but it will often have to do with the fulfillment of the nature of something.
Yeah, and whether that's like a nature proper, like in the case of a horse, or
what's the nature of heat?
Yeah,
or grammar.
But then the nature of grammar, I mean, is that a nature? Or
it's not really, right?
But, I mean, it's human imposed, so I guess more in the realm of an artifact.
Yeah.
But even so,
there's some kind of trajectory.
It then comes with a set of expectations.
Yes.
That is, within the context of those expectations, it's being thought of as a privation.
Yeah, and I think that's quite a helpful thing to realize. So the difference between the two is that with a privation, something is actually there, right? You have an expectation, say level 5, and you have achieved something less than the expectation, say level 2. Okay, so now you can talk about the level 2 version, and you can say, okay, it's evil because of the difference between 2 and 5, which is negative. It's negative 3, right? But there is still something there. And so we can say the 2 is evil, right? Yeah. But we have to distinguish, we have to say why we say it's evil. It's evil because it falls short of the expectation, which would be 5, not because it's some negative reality or something.
I think 2 things. The one is just to say that I wonder if the language of evil is actually what shoots us in the foot there.
A little bit,
because when we're talking about the fact that a horse doesn't have a nose, well, I mean, that could be the way that we typically talk about it in sort of contemporary, common parlance is, that could be the result of evil. The horse lacking a nose isn't itself evil, right? But I mean, it is bad.
Yeah, bad.
So I mean, I wonder if it's not.
So we're going to call this the problem of bad.
The problem of badness.
Yeah, but that's true. Often people speak about evil as though it's a moral category only, or something like that, and so they try to find like the evil intention or something behind something.
Yeah, the word evil comes with distinctly moral overtones in the way that we typically use it.
Yeah.
In a technical philosophical sense, we can talk more broadly about evil as badness, but in the way that we just generally use the word, it's badness that we've really got in mind.
Badness, disorder, defect.
Yeah.
Any of these kind of capture basically the same idea.
Although aren't necessarily interchangeable. And it's worth just stressing that, because otherwise that lands us in some places where we're calling something a defect when actually that would be a very nasty way of referring to it.
I'm using all of those words in a technical and neutral sense.
But they all have their place.
Yeah.
And all effectively gesture towards the same underlying reality. Yeah. We just want to be careful with languages.
Yeah, really. But I guess, let's limit defect to artifact for a moment, just so you can say like, oh, this is the defective chair.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And it's like, why is it defective? It's not that there isn't a chair there, it's that this chair doesn't fulfill all my expectations of a chair.
Yeah.
And to that extent,
it doesn't
is
carry
defective.
more than 2 kilograms.
Yeah. Or it's wobbly or something, chair. So I can't sit in it without falling over, or like the back is weak or something like that, right?
Yeah.
We talk about mental disorder sometimes, which is the expectation is often when we talk about mental disorders about having like a reasonable quality of life, right? And anything that frustrates that reasonable gets in the way of having a reasonable quality of life is considered a mental disorder. So we would call that an evil, but not to ascribe some responsibility to the person. It's like you don't get to choose whether you have anxiety or OCD or depression or something. But so it's an evil, but not a moral evil.
The second thing is, in some sense, circling back around to, well, if we're talking about, and some of the problem behind it, I guess, but if we're talking about something that is bad as, in a qualified sense, an absence, what about things that are described in positive terms, like a bad action?
Right.
Or things like actions that wouldn't necessarily have taken place otherwise, if not for the fact that they were an aberration in some sense. So according to a squirrel's nature and what we would reasonably expect of a squirrel, it is good for it to, or it's sort of expected for it to gather nuts, to climb trees, to cross the road when cars are coming. These are the sorts of things that we come to expect of squirrels. It would be an aberration. It would be outside of our expectations for a squirrel to eat toothpaste or to keep up with the Kardashians.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I mean, that'd be impressive for a squirrel.
Yeah, I mean, we don't generally ascribe morality to squirrels, but I mean, that would be morally reprehensible.
Yeah. That's funny. Funny joke. Yeah. Sorry to any of our listeners who watch the Kardashians, although we don't hold them in high esteem. You can unsubscribe now if you want.
Honestly,
hot take.
There are worlds that don't intersect. I think people who listen to our podcast and people who keep up with the Kardashians are very unlikely to
very small
exist in the same world.
Yeah.
Anyway, but I guess there's a positive action, eating toothpaste, that the squirrel, like, that sounds like a bad squirrel. Or like there's still an action taking place, so we could still, in some sense, construe what's going on in positive terms, but how does privation fit in there? It's
whenever you talk about action, it's helpful to think about it if you're coming at it from an Aristotelian perspective, which we are. It's helpful to think about it in terms of means and ends and means, right? So an end is something I desire, and then a mean is something I desire for the sake of some end, right? And an end can itself be a mean to another end, and so on and so on and so forth, right? But you can say, like, I want to eat, right? I want to get food. That's my end, and the means there is to walk downstairs to the restaurant that we were just at and go eat food or something. And so I don't desire to walk for its own sake. I desire to walk for the sake of eating food. If it were up to me, I would sit on my couch and play Elden Ring all day. You can think of the distinction is helpful because you can think of what it means to be privative in either sense, as with regards to a mean and with regards to an end. So with regards to a mean, if I desire something for this as a mean to some end, but it's not good at actually achieving that end, I'm kind of mistaken, then that's a privation, right? Because there the expectation is I desire something that actually achieves the end. But in reality, it's not achieving the end as effectively as it could. Yeah. And now this is interesting because it's not like the difference between walking and running necessarily, right? Like that is one way of doing it. Like I achieve the end faster or slower. Yeah. But it could be like the difference between doing cartwheels or not, or crawling on the ground or something. Not because necessarily I'm going slower, but because those are less efficient ways or less effective ways of getting to the thing. Another completely different way would be if I phoned the restaurant who doesn't do deliveries and asked them to just come across the road upstairs and bring the food, right? That's a privation. It's not a privation of walking or anything. It's just that's not an effective way of achieving the end that I desire. Yeah. And so it's a disordered. I'm disordered in my desiring that as a means to that particular end. Yeah. Okay. Now, an end itself, ultimately, if you're thinking of like ultimate ends, they will be judged according to the degree to which they fulfill our nature. So, like, do I desire to eat ice cream to the point where I become gluttonous, or to the point where I like get food poisoning? I don't know if ice cream can do that, but and to the point where I'm like sick or something like that, right? Yeah. That there, the like balance of what I desire is determined more to the degree of like more by the fulfillment of my nature, what it means for me to flourish as the kind of thing that I am. Yeah, no, that's helpful. That's actually another good example about privation is that I just gave and didn't even realize I was doing it. But there, the privation isn't eating less ice cream. The privation is eating too much ice cream. Yeah. And again, it's disordered because it's not because it's about the amount of ice cream I'm doing. It's not, the absence isn't the amount of ice cream. The absence is in the proper ordering of my passions to a particular end. Like how much do I desire this end? Yeah. In proper proportion to what it is.
So it really does come down to identifying the specific aspect or the specific action or intention or thing that does have existence, where we're saying that's where we find privation to just understand like how this actually does fit into an apt description of reality. Yeah. How it isn't just an absence, plain and simple. Actually, it's an absence in this qualified sense in this particular aspect of whatever it is that we're talking about.
Yeah, I guess
it's parasitic is, I think, to come back to the way you described it earlier. Brian Davies very helpfully explains that.
Also describes it as parasitic.
Same way. Okay. Yeah. It's like a hole.
Yeah, I think one of the most helpful ways of saying this is falling short of expectation. And that falling short is what we're talking about when we talk about the absence that's present in a privation.
It's funny that I mentioned a hole and then you talk about falling short.
Yeah. Although apparently not very deep because it's a short hole. But falling short of
you falling and you're short.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's it. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Falling while short. Yeah. You're falling short of expectations, which can sometimes be doing too much because your expectation is to be proportionate. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So a whole exists. We wouldn't say that a whole doesn't exist, but actually the whole is the fact that there isn't any ground where we expected there to be ground.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
So
the whole is an interesting example because there's a difference between a whole and just space. Right? The whole requires a boundary. There is still something there, but we focus on the difference of what's not there versus what is there, kind of, or what could be there versus what is there.
Yeah.
So there is still something present. Yeah.
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 All right. So with privation, that's I think a reasonably explained way of understanding privation. Reasonably defended, I think. Where does God fit into the picture?
Well, now we come to the relationship between an agent and an instrument. So an agent essentially cooperates with an instrument by definition. That's what we're saying. I have recently discovered that sometimes Aquinas doesn't use that language, by the way. So sometimes he'll talk about an instrument as something distinct from a secondary cause. But other times he's happy to talk about an instrument as a secondary cause.
Interesting.
So it depends on the context. So just as a hat tip to anyone who's been like, I know Aquinas sometimes has a problem with that. Yes, but we're just using it in the looser sense where those are definitionally the same thing.
Yeah.
You have to ask, okay, God is acting through this instrument. How could the instrument limit God's action? Okay, and now we use our analogy of cooperation to help us. We're going to look at our essential cooperation through artifacts and then transpose that over to the question of God in nature, which we don't have direct access to. Yeah. This is what we discussed in the last episode.
Yeah.
So let's say I'm using a stick to push something. Okay, I'm using my prodder, right? So I'm acting on the stick, acting through the prodder. How could the prodder limit my action of pushing something? So the prodder pushes the stone, but I push the stone through the prodder as well. Yeah. So how is the prodder limiting it? I think there's two senses at least in which the prodder limits it. There's what we could call an inherent limitation and a privative limitation. You can see by that. So we need to distinguish these two so that we can talk about privation specifically. So an inherent limitation is a limitation that the instrument has just by virtue of fulfilling its nature and not another nature.
Yeah.
Right? So like in the case of a prodder and a stick, if a stick is only so long, like I can't push further away from me than the length of the stick. Right? That's just like I've chosen this stick. I can only do certain things with this stick.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know if you can think of another
well, I mean,
inherent limitation.
There are plenty of variations on that. Like if a stick's too short, if a stick's too big, if a stick's too thick, you can't draw a fine line. If a stick is tiny, you can't draw a thick line. You can't dig a trench with a twig. Yeah. So those are all great examples. A privative limitation would be one where the stick fails to... Now, the stick falls short of... the prodder falls short of the expectation. So I'm moving the prodder to a particular end. I'm trying to achieve a particular end with the prodder. And it fails to achieve that end. Okay. Now, in the case of artifacts, this is often because I put too much expectation on the artifact, right? So the underlying thing, the stick, isn't able to support the ends for which I'm using it. So it's a fault on my part. In God's case, that's not the case because there isn't a separately existing underlying thing. But nevertheless, you can sort of get what we're getting at now. Okay, so imagine I try and push a boulder with a twig, right? The twig will buckle at some point under the pressure and break. At some point,
right? Depending on how hard you're pushing the boulder.
Early on.
Yeah.
Like if you're really trying to move the boulder, probably fairly early on.
Even in the case, so I've recently started skateboarding, and so what will sometimes happen, not with me because I'm not at all at this level, but what will often happen with the people who are more experienced at the skate park, this skateboard will break under the pressure after enough times. They'll do the same thing many, many times, but eventually the skateboard will break. And the skateboard is designed to withstand that sort of pressure, right? But at a certain point, its structural integrity has been weakened sufficiently that it can no longer achieve the ends for which it was designed. And then it breaks, and then they have to get a new skateboard. That happens surprisingly often. I've asked a few different sort of professional or more professional skaters, like, how long do your boards usually last? And it's about 3 to 6 weeks. Yeah, which is crazy. And these boards are not like paper thin things. They're really hard.
6 weeks.
Yeah.
That sounds like an expensive career.
Yeah. Well, they get the replacement boards for free. So I realized that's the next thing I realized is like, oh, okay, you don't have to pay like $5,000 every 6 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, if you got like endorsements and stuff like that, that's cool.
Yeah.
Then I guess you're exerting that sort of pressure on because like that's what you do.
So maybe the skateboard is a pretty good artifact to use in this case.
Yeah.
Because it has inherent limitations, which is why you can't fly or why you need to do a lot of work to get the skateboard into the air when you ollie, right? It's because it's got certain inherent limitations in the way that the board is designed. Yeah. That's like how it's going to move and that's often what factors into a person's choice of boards and trucks and everything is how it will do certain things that they like. But then there are those privative limitations that happen through wear and tear that prevent it from fulfilling its function at some point, and then it just breaks, and then we have to get a new one.
Yeah. Right. There was an example that I thought of, and now it's gone.
Okay. Well, I'll just underscore the fact that saying there, the expectation arises from our design of the skateboard.
Yeah.
Just like any other artifact, like complex artifact, like a chair or a table or something. Yeah. Okay. So now, if we translate that over to God's essential cooperation with nature, we have inherent limitations would be the limitations of your nature, right? So as a human being, we are spatio-temporal creatures, right? So God's power through us is limited to the place and time that we're existing. God can't make me naturally shout or throw a ball to the other side of the planet. Just like my nature is not such that I'm capable of doing that, right? Yeah. He could make an angel do that. They can move instantaneously from one place to another. So like, great, and that's a different nature. He can't make you were talking about a squirrel earlier. The squirrel cannot appreciate to any degree what's happening and keeping up with the conditions. No matter how much God wants the squirrel to do that to prove us wrong, like that, there's just the nature of a squirrel just is not consistent with that sort of conceptualization, that level of conceptualization.
Yeah.
A privative limitation now is what we would call evil. Okay. So that would be that God, by our nature, in ordering our nature, is ordering us towards the fulfillment of that nature in our choices. So and we are limiting the exercise of that power. So that we do not either desire what's good for us or we do not desire the proper means to the ends that are good for us, right? Yeah. So he orders our nature towards and all the actions within it towards what's good for that nature, the fulfillment of that nature, and we limit the extent to which that ordering is realized. And that limiting is that falling short of the expectation that's given by the natural ordering.
Yeah.
Okay, do you have any questions?
Well, I mean, I guess that those would be the instances where we do something stupid.
Yes.
That would be where we make bad decisions that are the sorts of decisions that we could ascribe morality to. Yeah.
Well, whenever the limitation involves your will.
Yes. Yeah.
To the degree that it involves your will, then we call it moral. Yeah. Because he's also, the same applies to the horse with the gangrene foot, right? He's ordering the horse's nature to proper fulfillment of that nature, which is proper development and healthiness. Yeah. But something's gone wrong at the material or cellular or, biological level that's frustrating it. It's a problem. It is contrary to nature, but it's not moral because it doesn't involve a will. Yeah. Unless it does involve a will, like someone gave it gangrene. But then all things being equal, it's not.
Well, if somebody gave it gangrene there, but then we're actually talking about different
two type of things.
Yeah,
that's true. So that's the main proposal. I guess the question is, does this mean that we're sort of fighting against God, right? Like, does this imply that we have some force in us that counteracts the force of God that orders us towards the good?
Yeah.
That's that I think would be the main, and we want to say no, because if you think about it,
actually mean that free will does in fact contradict.
Yeah. Well,
God's control.
So that's the main thing. That's the main reason we want to say no. In the articulation of the model, we also want to say no because there isn't anything in us that exists apart from God's acting through us.
Yeah.
Right? Because remember, what God acts on is not something that already exists.
Yeah.
We're brought into existence by the bringing of our nature. Just like if you die and your activity of life stops, you no longer exist. Like the corpse is not you, right? Like the corpse is something that just very closely resembles you. In some respects. And so for this, I think that this is why I articulated limitation and why we've spoken about privation as we have. Because it's not that, if you think about the difference that's happening. So again, let's go back to the 2 and the 5 that we're talking about. Like God is ordering us to 5. We are going to 2. The difference there isn't something positive. It's not like we're coming from the outside and pushing it to the 2. It's that we are limiting the good influence of God's activity, so that we're almost contributing a negative thing, right? So it's not like we're coming and pushing it 3 the other way from the outside. It's just that we're not allowing, or we're not capable or something of
not living up to their
not fully realizing the good that God is ordering us in. And this is the same. Again, we think about this all the time with instrument. Now we can go back to the instrument case, right? When the skateboard breaks, it's not like the skateboard is pushing against the skater's action. It's that the skateboard isn't able to reach the place where the skateboarder is trying to draw it to. Right. It's strictly speaking a limitation. Like, this is why we've been using the word limitation to make clear that it's not something positive that we're adding on to constrain it. It's just we can't reach to the full extent that you might draw to, either because my nature is limited or because there's something privative in me that's preventing me from fully realizing my nature. Same with a hammer. If you're trying to hit something and then it shatters or something, it's not like the hammer somehow got outside of itself and pushed back against it's like, no, the hammer just couldn't go where you were drawing it to, right? Like it just at this point it was too weak, or the metal had rusted or something like that.
And then, I mean, I think by way of wrapping up, what this actually says about God in the end ends up being better, not worse. The fact that God can bring about positive ends even through limited means.
That's a good point. Because it's important to actually, there's an important distinction here, because you have to ask the question, what is God's relation to the action? Now you have to say, well, now what we've done is we've decomposed the action into 2 things. There's the ordering given to it by God, and there's the limitation given to it by the creature, which is a negative parasitic reality. So it's not adding anything in addition to God. Okay. What is the relation between those 2 aspects of it? Well, God, first and foremost, wills the thing that he contributes, right? Which is the ordering to the full good of the action or of the nature or whatever, right? He isn't causing the creature to be limited. Right, the creature is limited, and he doesn't have to cause the creature to be limited because it's not a positive reality. All right, it's just, so we say that he permits the difference. He permits the negative difference, the absence, the privation, but he wills the good in the action. So we can say that, and now if evil arises out of the privation, then we can say that he wills good and permits evil. But it is nevertheless, just like I can use an instrument that's rusty, I can use a hammer that's rusty, or I can use a skateboard that's a bit beaten up, exactly. I can skate a bit lighter, I can, work around it if I want to. So too, he can work with our limitations to bring about the good that he's ultimately ordering. And
in fact, a pretty strong theological point is made through, through the whole Bible story at a number of points, that God intentionally uses limited means to show how much more powerful he is, to show how much greater he is, to show how much more loving and kind that he is. The story, there are a bunch of them that come to mind, but there are 2 that are sort of, I guess, most prominent as we're thinking about this at the moment. There's the story of Gideon, where he takes his army down to the river, and God says, okay, anybody who drinks this way, tell them they can go home, and anybody who drinks the other way, they can stay. And I'm a bit rusty on the order of events in the story, but there are a bunch of these sorts of tests that I think he takes them through. And at each point, he's like, no, army's still too big. Make them do another one.
He's like whittling down the size of the army. Okay.
To the point where he starts with this fairly impressive army. Like, okay, no, you stand a fighting chance here. You should go for it. And God's like, nope, I want less. It's like, that's
the opposite of what
counterintuitive. And he ends up going through with this handful of people, but great strategy. And in the end, like, it's just abundantly clear that the good that was brought about, which was God liberating his people from an oppressive nation, was very clearly achieved by God and not by Gideon's military might.
So that's an example of natural limitation, right? No matter how good the army is, like, assume they're all perfect, right? At a certain point, if you only have like 20 people, like, there's only so much you can do with 20 perfect soldiers against an army of like 200,000, right? So God is going beyond the natural limitations there, but like, he's sort of whittling down the natural limitation to something where it's clear that God must have made up the difference.
Yeah,
with what's going on.
Yeah. The other, and actually that victory wasn't achieved by us. I mean, you could think of Hezekiah's deliverance from the Assyrians in Kings, where you've got this very vulnerable Jerusalem who are surrounded by this massive army of Assyrians, and like they've been under siege for a while already, and it's like it's a matter of time, and God actually swoops in with an army of angels and just wipes them out. Like, very different story. That was very obviously supernatural. That was very obviously God bringing about victory, but through his mighty means. Like, okay, cool. Actually, what is going on in Gideon's story is they do it in there's no supernatural intervention, but the way that it happens is very clearly God's working through the situation because the odds are just stupid.
Yeah, right.
The other, which I think is more privative, is Paul in 2 Corinthians, where he's got the thorn in his flesh, thorn in his side, or whatever, however it's worded, and he pleads with God, take it away, please. And God says to him, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And I mean, it's such a powerful message, and I think has resonated with so many people going through times of really acute suffering. But I think it also points to kind of what God might be doing. And I guess this is very well something we'll circle back around to when we actually talk about the problem of suffering and how it's experienced from our end of it. But in thinking about the philosophical model and why God might be doing the way that he does, actually, a lot of the time we see this sort of these limitations that God permits. But in hindsight, or with a bit of perspective, we can see, well, actually, God is doing that, and that says something very powerful about God that wouldn't otherwise have been said.
Yeah, I mean, that's two thoughts come to mind when you say that. The one that I always go to, which is moral in nature. The two you've mentioned are not moral in nature, which is quite interesting, which is great because I hadn't really thought of them at all. Is the one that I always kind of go to, which is moral in nature, is the Joseph story, Genesis 50 verse 20, where he literally...
that was another one that came to mind for me.
Because he literally says, like, you meant this for evil, but God used it to bring about good that many would be saved. Yeah. And it's like, okay, wow. So there's a clear separation between the responsibility of the evil, which is laid on the feet of the brothers, and there's the good that is brought about by God through the actions. Obviously, it's not quite at the level of metaphysics that we're dealing with here, but you get that disparate, assigning of responsibility to God and the secondary agent.
And that's maybe just a point worth making, that nobody in the biblical periods were thinking with this model in mind. They weren't metaphysically analyzing what was going on. Yeah. But we can make sense of what was going on using an explanatory framework like this. Yeah. That actually is very well illustrated by these stories.
Yeah, and then I think Aquinas in his Summa Theologia talks about how something, I'm going to misquote him, but something like God is so good that he can bring good out of evil, or something like that. And it's the basic idea of what you were talking about with Paul's thorn in the side kind of thing.
Yeah. So we're going to end it there. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Ring that notification bell if you're on YouTube. Leave us a rating if you're on your favorite podcast app. And we'll see you in the next one.